Is that the way life is, Rick?
That is the way life is.
Oh, okay.
Okay, wow. Oh, Chris, hi. But immediately,
Hi.
as soon as I started this, it says that our feed has been deleted on our Facebooks, but I'm trying to get it back. Okay,
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know. We might not be there on Facebook. So if you can't hear me because we're not there on Facebook, come over to us on YouTube.
There we go. So,
Okay.
right, yeah.
I don't know. Calling Chris Anderson.
Chris Anderson is here in Studio W2 here in Windsor.
I love that you have numbers for every studio.
Well, it makes me feel more important than I actually am. And you're in Chicago, still basking in the glow of
high above Michigan Avenue. Yes, basking in the glow of our 40th wedding anniversary party, which was a blowout. Noticed you weren't there, but you were invited. You were invited.
Well, okay, sorry.
Okay, so
I thought I'd celebrate my own anniversary.
That's you're coming up on one, or you're just having one?
Sailed right by.
Okay.
This is like one of the first anniversaries I can remember being at because I wasn't in Normandy.
I know, we're not in Normandy, which is amazing all by itself. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thank you to Stephen Ambrose Tours for not sending us to Normandy this June.
Exactly right.
And for their assistance in bringing you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening maybe in your car to the HHH podcast, welcome. And Chris, I've been looking at our podcast numbers. It may not be up there with John McManus, multiple podcast guy.
Well, he kind of throws the curve.
I know, but we're doing pretty good. We have a lot of people who are listening. And so to all the people who are listening, no pictures in this week's show, so you're not missing anything. Today we're going to have another D-Day special with two amazing historians. Well, the two historians that we could get. So, but all good. And Chris, I should mention our Patreon supporters have not finished updating this list. We'll do so by our next show. Well, by 2 weeks from now, I promise to have it done. And so please, if you want to support us, and we did get a couple of supporters this week, join us at patreon.com/historyhappyhour. And Chris, the last thing I wanted to mention, it struck me, this should be now part of our marketing, right?
Yes. Okay.
This is an AI-free zone.
Yes, it is.
Okay. We don't use AI to come up with our questions. We don't use it to do anything. So we are AI. In fact, if I'm tempted, this is how I stop myself, by announcing that this is an AI-free zone.
But I mean, I want to know though, would like the avatars of both of us in AI look better?
In which case, it could quickly become an AI busy zone. All right, fair enough. So we have 82 people. Do we already here, Chris? Can you give us a sense of any of the people who are here?
Yeah, well, John Gallagher is joining us, and John, I hope you're doing well. I hope your tree is thriving. Barry Milgate here. Ross, who wants to know if Rick, are you replacing me? Are you replacing me?
Am I replacing you, Chris?
Yeah, that's what Ross wants to know.
I am not.
Okay, well, that's a relief.
But I don't have the authority to replace you.
Right.
You'd have to agree to that replacing. So, anyway.
I'm not
not expecting
Anybody else?
Anyone else? We have Doug McCord, who I just saw at my anniversary party. Hey, Doug, great to see you. And Gwen Simons and Xavier.
We're international.
Yeah, we're international, so we're all good. All right, let's get going with this thing before John and Joe just decide that they're going to take off and not join us.
But I was
bars
post-anniversary glow, I guess. Yes.
All right.
So no, I mean, we kind of hinted at this. This is a D-Day special, and the focus this week will be about the Americans, although we're anxious to take questions about all the people that were involved and all the beaches. But we really have a treat this week. We have joining us Joe Balkoski and John McManus, who I think it's safe to say are recognized as the world's foremost authorities, particularly on the Americans in Normandy and in Western Europe. And of course, we said that we weren't going to talk about the Americans this week because they were joining us, but you said that was a bad idea. So we're going to benefit from their knowledge and just have a great conversation about D-Day and the Normandy campaign. And this is a chance that you will not get again anytime soon. So please kind of dial in with your questions and feel free to ask away.
And Chris, can I just mention before we officially welcome John and Joe that just to remind people that John's book about one end of Omaha Beach is the dead and those about to die, and Joe's book, which does cover as part of it the other end of Omaha Beach, is the book Beyond the Beachhead about the 29th Infantry Division. So buy their books; they will appreciate it.
Well, and Joe also wrote, of course, Omaha and Utah, which is
well, yes.
But I didn't know. I wasn't
going to bring them up.
You said you didn't have pictures, or I would have said.
Okay.
Anyway.
Hi guys.
Good to see you.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey. All right. So
well.
Yeah. All right. So to get things going, this is a quote, as Rick always mentions. I love quotes. Eisenhower is in an argument with Air Force commanders about getting air assets for the Normandy assault, and he says, in response to Air Force leaders' demands that they remain in control of Allied strategic air forces, we pointed out that the venture the United States and Great Britain were now about to undertake could not be classified as an ordinary tactical movement in which consequences would be no greater than those ordinarily experienced through success or failure in battle. What's Eisenhower driving at? Why is it special, and why does it resonate the way it does?
So I think he's probably alluding to the overall strategic importance of the Normandy invasion to the entire Allied war effort. 1944 is an election year in the United States. If the Normandy invasion is a big fail, it's going to affect the American political scene and perhaps the Germany first policy. It's going to affect global operations on a major scale. Not to mention, of course, what it means for the war in Europe and what happens on the Eastern Front, what happens in relation to the German occupation of much of the continent. I mean, there's a lot riding on this thing, and they've been building up toward it for some time. So I think the way I interpret that, at least, is Eisenhower is saying this isn't any ordinary operation where we may or may not be able to use air power. We need to use every arrow in our quiver here, to make sure this thing succeeds.
Yeah.
Joe?
Well, and also remember that great answer. Remember that the bomber barons, which of course included British and American strategic bomber proponents, were very used to having an independent perspective on the war, and it was. I think I'm being delicate when I say that they were not enthusiastic about being distracted from their major mission, which was to destroy German industry. In fact, there's a very telling quote that Karl Spaatz, the commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, I think he didn't intend this to go into print, but it did. He at one point said, this blankety blank, and use whatever dirty word you want in that space. He said, this blankety blank invasion will never work, and they should just leave it for us to bring Germany to its knees. So clearly that was, Eisenhower had to fight the sentiment that the bomber barons were not subordinate to him. And it went right up to Roosevelt, Churchill. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, and Spaatz, the only invasion he advocated is an invasion of Norway, the notional British Fourth Army invasion of Norway. He thought it'd be better to have a kind of peripheral strategy there. In addition, like you said, Joe, that the bomber campaign would bring Germany to its knees in any way that was really important.
So this
right.
It's safe to say then it's not an exaggeration. This was different.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I think enormously different. I mean, the entire kind of political and military capital of this Western Allied coalition is now invested in this, and certainly for the Americans who've been lobbying for the better part of 2 years for just this kind of thing. to kind of, mitigate against the British Mediterranean strategy. And the British, of course, are kind of famously reluctant to launch this invasion. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot invested in this, and Eisenhower kind of represents that American point of view, but also the larger Western Allied coalition that, in order to have this so-called second front that the Soviets have been screaming about for the better part of 2 years, this thing needs to succeed.
Right.
Well, I wanted to. Go ahead. Go ahead, Joe.
It also became a political / civilian issue because, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but Winston Churchill opposed the use of strategic bombing in the so-called transportation plan because I believe he said that 200,000 French civilians would be killed. And he said that's not the way to win friends, in the liberation of France. And I think Eisenhower pretty much laid his job on the line and said, either you let me have control or I'm going to resign. And Franklin Roosevelt backed him up on it.
Well, in fact, yeah, I think that's actually one of the only times that they're really bringing the French even into the discussions about all this to say, and the French are going to have to say, no, this is, bomb away.
Yeah, they actually consult the French. I
mean, which is unusual.
Exactly. I mean, Churchill is really worried about damaging French infrastructure, of course, and killing French civilians in this bombing campaign that's generally known as the transportation plan that Eisenhower will really kind of insist upon. Because his point, in a way, to the Americans is a kind of local point of saying, well, you can always go back to your place in the Western Hemisphere. We got to live with these people, going forward. And if we're responsible for this, it's going to poison relations for who knows how long. And so they go to the Free French, de Gaulle and his people, and they give their really kind of draconian estimates of what a transportation plan could cost in terms of lives. And the French commanders basically say to be rid of the Germans, we would pay twice that. Now, that's their perspective. If we're just everyday people somewhere in France not thinking along those ways, I mean, not looking at it that way. But I think I'm really glad that Joe brought that up because I think it brings to mind the sacrifice of the French in their own liberation. Certainly with the transportation plan and the Belgians too, by the way, because they're part of it as well. Yeah. Fortunately, the estimates are no longer are wildly exaggerated, and I think you're talking in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. Still, that's a lot, much less than what happens to the Battle of Normandy. The fighting on the ground, the cost of that, and then the military contribution.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring in a couple of questions that came to us before we started the show today. And the first one is from Matt Brogy, and it's directed at John. And he says, what's it like being a Cardinals fan? How do you deal with depression?
Well, okay. Matt, the thing is, not all of us can spend $500 million on payroll to buy Matt Brogy is a Los Angeles Dodgers fan who roots for an evil empire. I'll just put that on the record now. But
the Cardinals are doing very well right now.
They are, and of course, the Cardinals have more legitimate World Series championships than the Dodgers. But for someone like Matt Brogy, what else do we expect? Obviously.
Okay, so I'm going to come up with Matt has some serious questions as well.
Joe has some comments about this.
And which team won the World Series in 1944? I want to ask that too.
You guys don't know anything about this since I have been a Mets fan since 1962. And, you're in a different stratosphere. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
My condolences, Joe. I know it's been rough for you.
So I'm gonna rescue Matt here and present one of his serious questions as well. But so he wants to know, is it possible to pinpoint a moment, or at least a general time of day, when the Omaha Beach invasion turned in favor of the Americans? And who were some of the key U.S. soldiers, sailors that make it happen? And Joe, I'm going to ask you to start with this question, and then John, you'll get time to think. I'm going to put him right on the spot.
It's going to parallel John's answer. It's earlier than you think. It began. I'm estimating the tide began to turn within 2 hours or 2.5 hours of the initial landing, when soldiers began to realize that the way off the beach was not through the draws, but between the draws and up the bluffs. And that conclusion, I'm sure John will corroborate on his side of the beach and mention the key First Division fellows who did that action on the east side. On the west side, it really was a function of the follow-on companies on Dog Green Beach. A company, as you know, was slaughtered and became ineffective. But the follow-on companies, B and C, swung to the east out of necessity when they watched the carnage that was happening. And, it's a complicated story, but some very, very dynamic junior leaders and junior NCOs reached the conclusion that, hey, we can make it up these bluffs if we can penetrate the Promenade Road barbed wire and probably walk through the middle of minefields. But a fellow named Walter Taylor of B Company of the 116th was probably led the first boat team up the bluffs, and he was followed almost by the entirety of C Company of the 116th, and that is the group that Norm Coda accompanied. And so you had probably in the range of 250 men by 8:30 in the morning who were operating between the D1 and the D3 draws, and they were doing what they were supposed to do. They were getting behind the Germans. They were engaging the local resistance nests, and to cut to the chase, they were opening up the door for an ever widening door, I should say, for follow-up troops who were going to do the same thing. And John will give you a more specific story of the First Division.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I would say already, at the latest by about 10:30 in the morning, something like that. Do you think, Joe, somewhere around there, we can start to say that things are beginning to turn? Prior to that, of course, in the First Division sector, we've got several groups that make it off the beach in their own spots. To the extreme east, you have a guy named Kimball Richmond, who's a company commander. I think he had I Company 16th Infantry. But he becomes kind of a de facto battalion commander because some of the other company commanders were down and some of the other officers were down. He kind of puts together this scratch force, which, of course, is going to involve a guy named Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith and a sergeant by the name of Warazbite, very unusual name, who were involved in that eastern flank fight. Joe described it really, I think, very, very well in his book, Omaha Beach, which is an incredible book. He described their terrain that they're fighting as like a natural amphitheater. And that's the extreme eastern part of Omaha Beach, what's called WN60. That's where they're fighting, and that's one of the first penetrations there. A little bit farther to the west, of course, you have the Spalding-Striesick section, that boat section, which is among E Company 16th Infantry, really the only one that lands in more or less the right spot, though their landing is not easy, mainly because of the depth of the water and things of that nature. They do get ashore, and they are some of the first ones off the beach, and they're going to just administer tremendous damage to the Germans, especially at WN64 in the course of the day. So you have that going on, and then you got the follow-on forces that are either pinned down or advancing, in their due course, over those hours. But I think one of the decisive moments is when the destroyers come in, like late morning, and have a better idea of where to expend their ordnance to help the ground troops, because there's been a lot of confusion over that. There's a lot of smoke and dust. This is resolved a little bit better by that latter part of the morning, and I think that is crucial firepower for these initial groups to get off the beach and survive. So I would say, to answer the question in a general sense, maybe by about 10:30 in the morning, maybe 11 in the morning, something like that. And I agree, it's earlier than generally we have thought.
So guys, I spend a fair amount of time, obviously, in Normandy, but I also spend quite a bit of time in the Pacific, and I've talked about Operation Forager. I just had a Pacific trip this past March, and one of the things that I think you can see when looking at the Pacific battles, particularly with the Marines, is a bit of an evolution in how they approach amphibious assaults, storm landings, say from Tarawa on. A lot of people say that Tarawa, November of 43 is sort of the pivot point for the Marines and how they approach amphibious warfare doctrine. obviously there is one for the Army, but can you talk a little bit about how the Army approaches amphibious assaults? Because again, in 1941, they're sort of starting from scratch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so the Army in the Pacific, especially by 1943 and 44, their main approach with amphibious assault begins with loading. It's an unglamorous thing like loading. What is the loading plan? Meaning, what can we transport aboard ship? Because obviously everything has to be transported aboard ship somewhere. And then how do we prioritize what we're loading in terms of how we're going to unload it? And what that's going to mean for the actual assault with the kind of weaponry we're going to employ. So I really think in some ways they're kind of ahead of the folks in Europe in that respect, because there have been, so many kind of low-level amphibious invasions, in the course of the war at that point, and the Army really carrying out the majority of them already. In addition to the lesson the Marines are losing and the fact that they're working together closely, quite often the Marines and the Army, most notably in the Marshall Islands in January and February 1944, where you have one division from each service. So they had gotten a sense of the kind of supporting firepower they were going to need, and that really boiled down to combined arms. And obviously, then I think that certainly influences what they're doing in Europe. It already would have, based on what they dealt with in the Mediterranean.
Right.
But I think that the Army's approach begins with loading and whatever the shipping is, coordination with the Navy, and then like combined arms supporting firepower once you are ashore, and how you're going to manipulate that.
All right. Well, but Joe, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
I think that's a great answer, and but in Europe, the amphibious doctrine was at first, of course, dominated by the British, and completely justifiably, because they were the first to really understand the challenges that would be faced. And of course, the challenges in Europe were, particularly in Northwest Europe, when you start to talk about overlord, the challenges of that initial wave are very different than they would be in the Pacific. Germans having 4 years to prepare. I'm not an expert in the Pacific, but I assume the amount of concrete the Germans used in the Calais coast and the Normandy coast was significantly higher than it would have been in the Japanese-held islands. And of course, the islands were, in the Pacific, were not self-sustaining, whereas, of course, the German defenses in Europe could be resupplied by direct routes. However, clearly there were lessons to be learned, and the most notable story is the fellow that really managed. He was one of the managers of the Marshall Islands invasion. He commanded the 7th Infantry Division, Charles Corlett. He, in a masterful stroke, he seized Kwajalein, and he was transferred to Europe, and he was appalled at how little the British American amphibious planners paid attention to him. He gave a lecture on the Kwajalein invasion, and a British general, said, "General Corlett, that's a magnificent presentation you made." He said, "If we have an island to invade, you're the one to do it." So,
right.
That in a nutshell summarizes the differences between the Pacific and Europe.
Well, is it also a difference, though, that in the Pacific it's an entirely U.S. show, right? Whereas in Europe, you've got allies, and the allies, at least in Normandy, are providing about half of the naval forces,
at least.
So they're going to be kind of bringing their own doctrine, thoughts, ideas to the process, right?
Well, it's partially a team effort in the Pacific too, with the Australians, especially earlier in the war. The Australians are really, I would argue, that in 42 and 43, during a lot of the New Guinea operations, are carrying the load to a great extent in terms of land operations. Yeah. Naval, the Americans always have the preponderance, of course. Right. I think the dynamic is different, though, in terms of the larger alliance and obviously the Royal Navy as a highly experienced, world-leading Navy, and their own amphibious ideas and doctrine that the British have. It is a different dimension. And in terms of Corlett's experience, I think he's dismissed because the idea, I think, among some in Europe is, well, island invasions, what they're dealing with there isn't, applicable to a continental or a littoral invasion.
Right.
And there becomes this sort of big league view versus minor league in a way, the way some of the European theater people think, which I think is unfortunate, because I think they probably should have listened to him, because he was pretty high speed in terms of the way the 7th Division had operated at Kwajalein, and even before it had to, when he was not in command of the division at that point.
All right, so bring in another question from a viewer, putting it up on the screen. He says, why did the Americans continue to launch amphibious duplex drive floating tanks when they weren't designed for 6-foot waves, and 27 of 29 were almost immediately lost? And I should add to that question that that's true on the 1st Division side of Omaha Beach. On the 29th Division side of Omaha Beach, Dean Rockwell brought in most of those tanks. They have almost all of their tanks got in, although they got blasted pretty afterwards. But talk to us a little bit about that. And since we're talking about the side where it was pretty catastrophic, John, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Joe.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. So the reason this happens is that the lines of command, the ultimate decision-making power, is not in the hands of a naval officer, as it was with the gentleman you just mentioned on the 29th Division side, who understood a lot more about what the heavy choppy waves and seas would mean to the duplex drive tanks. The ultimate call on the Big Red 1 side for the 741st Tank Battalion is an Army officer by the name of Captain James Thornton. Thornton felt that his unit had trained up in this equipment, and that this is the purpose behind it all, and that even though the waves were problematic, that in some ways training, but also in a way honor, dictated that they needed to go forward this way. Because remember too, if you're asking the landing craft folks to get in closer, you're risking their lives. And so I think Thornton was a little reluctant to do that, and felt that he and his men were trained up on these DD tanks such to get them ashore. Unfortunately, he's wrong. And so what you end up with is, as we heard, the majority of the tanks sink, all but what, 3 of them, I think. And with a loss of average 1 crewman per tank, some of whom's remains are still there to this day. So it's a very sad tale in that respect. But I think it also leads to a bit of mythology in relation to our memory of Omaha Beach, that supposedly there's no armor ashore. There's a lot of armor ashore, just not as much as they had planned for. And this is one reason why. The irony of ironies, of course, is that there was one landing craft that they couldn't get the ramp down, and so that craft does go in. Instead of launching the tanks into the sea, they get ashore and they inflict great damage on the Germans. Sergeant Geddes and Sergeant Shepard, their 2 tanks really kind of neutralized the 88 millimeter gun that's at WN61, and then the 275s that are at WN62. I think they take them down too, at least according to most accounts. Another little interesting wrinkle to close the loop on this whole thing. There were other companies that were going to go in with the wader tanks, just like they'd done at Sicily and Salerno and in the Pacific, which is a better go, of course, as we know. Now, one of those tank companies was commanded by a guy named Edward Sledge, who actually was the brother of Eugene Sledge, who becomes, of course, very famous for the incredible memoir With the Old Breed, and then obviously in the Pacific miniseries. So one of the things I found in my research is that report by Sledge, Captain Sledge, and all about his experience, his crew, and the other crews there. It's really, really fascinating stuff.
Joe?
I'll talk about the 743rd Tank Battalion, which was attached to the 29th Division, and it had a completely different experience. Not a single tank DD tank, that is, was launched. I think the prescribed distance was 3,000 yards offshore. But upon Dean Rockwell, who was the naval, I believe he was a lieutenant junior grade, he, in the historiography of D-Day, he sort of come down as the hero of the 743rd Tank Battalion. But if you read the account by one of the company commanders, who I believe was named Elder, E-L-D-E-R, it's very clear that Rockwell and Elder discussed the matter as the tanks were getting ready to launch, and they both readily agreed that it was not a good idea, and they brought the LCTs in directly to the shore. But as John pointed out, that was a very dangerous thing to do as well. I mean, the tanks were not going to sink, but the crews of the LCTs were going to be subject to very intense fire. And of course, the tanks coming off of an LCT were going to be the object of very close range anti-tank fire. And many of them were hit, but it turned out that the tanks proved to be extremely useful on that sector of the beach. You know, when I think about it, you know, let's face facts. The DD tank was a totally brilliant invention. It was something that, under perfect conditions, and you know, they kept the secret of the DD tank right up until D-Day. And had there been more suitable conditions, the Germans certainly would have been very cowed by the appearance of 50, 60 tanks swimming on the ocean toward the beach, and then driving on the sand toward the strong points. It was a totally brilliant invention, and I should point out that the DD tanks worked well on the other beaches. The 70th Tank Battalion on Utah was a very experienced Mediterranean theater tank unit, and it did launch the DD tanks offshore, and they did not have the experience of the 741st. It just, you know, the water conditions off of Normandy are probably very unusual, and they just happen to have the good fortune of not having the waves be forming in such a way that their tanks were threatened. And of course, I'm not an expert on the British and the Canadian beaches, but the DD tanks on the Commonwealth beaches were also successful. So, you know, in short, it was a brilliant invention, and the 741st just had bad luck with the way the waves happened to be in their sector. And as you said, John, perhaps, you know, a sense of honor and valor that might have been great under a slightly different condition, but didn't work out, you know, in reality.
Yeah. So, guys, one of the other things is, I think, you know, we all tend to fall into the trap of Omaha Beach is the 1st Division and the 29th Division, Utah Beach is the 4th Division, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't really talk about all the other people that are involved in these things. And I, you know, I'm fascinated by the special brigades, right? And if you add, these are organizations that are almost the same size as some of these divisions that are assaulting. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of these organizations, special brigades in particular, kind of what they are, what their makeup is, what their size is, and sort of their part in these landings.
I'll jump in, John. You know, the special brigades were really what made the invasions tick, at least on the American side of things. Every American beach had a special engineer brigade, and of course Omaha had two, one for the western sector and one for the eastern sector. And when you look at the reports of those special engineer brigades, you see it was a unit of dozens and dozens of different specialties. And the leadership of the special brigades was comprised of the people who had pretty much founded and operated the U.S. Army Assault Training Center on the north coast of Devon, which is really what I like to call the playing fields of Eton for the American Army, because that's where every American unit learned the special techniques that would be needed to assault a fortified coast. And the guy who ran and founded the Assault Training Center was a fellow named Colonel Paul Thompson, and he ends up being, oh heck, I can't remember if he commanded the 5th or the 6th Special Brigade, but he commanded one of them. And he was badly wounded on Omaha Beach, but he is, you know, it was his contribution that really, at the risk of repeating myself, was the playing fields of Eton for the U.S. Army. And then, a quick note on the Utah Beach Special Engineer Brigade. That was a highly veteran engineer unit that had fought in the Mediterranean and really knew what it was doing. John may have much more information than I do about the engineer unit on the 1st Division side of things.
Yeah, I mean, all of it. This is, whether it's Omaha Beach, whether it's Utah, wherever, this is an engineering problem. Certainly because of the fortifications, because of the obstacles, the mines that you're dealing with, the relative lack of infrastructure, especially, of course, on the 1st Division side of Omaha Beach, where there's no paved roads. So you're going to have to deal with that. So as Joe mentioned, you've got engineers with all these different kinds of specialties coming in for different reasons and purposes. Now, those who are really at the sharpest end are part of the Gap assault teams that are kind of improvised in the weeks leading up to the invasion, joint Army Navy engineering teams that are going to go in among the first waves and hopefully blow gaps in the obstacles to help, create some maneuver room for tanks and troops. And, certainly that's problematic, and their casualties are horrible. But on the engineering side of the house, I mean, it just kind of depends what time of the day you're getting there, what your circumstances are. I mean, for a lot of the engineers on D-Day at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, it's just simply about road building, probably under shell fire, and probably during the night too. And of course, demining is such a huge part of this. I think that something in the order of about 1 out of every 4 American soldiers who goes ashore at Omaha Beach is an engineer or engineer affiliated in some way, shape, or form. And so the fact that we can even create these 3 engineer special brigades that are, like Chris had pointed out, very, very sizable, really speaks, I think, to the maturity of Allied engineering capability, but I think specifically in this case, American engineering capability. And of course, let's not forget that what's supposed to follow in the wake of this whole thing is the building of the Mulberry Harbor, at the 2 beaches. Of course, the British are going to have theirs at Gold, and the Americans theirs at Omaha Beach, which was quite ingenious too. So all of that is an engineering problem. And again, I have to kind of refer to the Pacific, where all of this is ongoing, where they are doing much of this same kind of stuff, in addition to the aviation engineers who are going to come into this whole thing in the wake of it, and build the fighter strips, build the other landing strips for transport aircraft, to evacuate wounded, to bring in supplies here and there. I mean, all of that kind of stuff is in the offing. So you could argue this is kind of an engineering operation in a way,
Yeah, but just really quickly, are these special brigades? I mean, when you say special brigade, is this an administrative function, or do these guys have unit identity, esprit de corps? Have they been around for a while, or are they kind of smaller subunits that they just said, "Hey, guess what, guys, you're this now"?
It's more like that. It's more like these engineer battalions of one sort or another that are now put together into the sort of clearinghouse home of a special brigade, and they have their own patch, the special brigade, of course. But I don't know that there's too many guys who go ashore, whether at Utah or Omaha, who are thinking about upholding the honor of the
right, that's what I mean,
brigade or something.
Right,
I mean,
right.
It isn't quite like that, but they would probably think of themselves more in relation to their battalions than the brigade, would be my guess. And of the people I knew, that's the way it tended to be. I'm not sure about all yours experience.
There's an exit on Omaha Beach, and I cannot think of which one it is, but they just built a new monument there at the base of it. It's on the eastern end of Omaha Beach. It used to be, well, you can still walk up there to the top, but there's a road that they built up there, and it was an engineering company, and all this information is in my notes someplace. But I talk about that this engineering company won a presidential unit citation because to build the road, they took like 25 people killed and all sorts of people wounded just to build the road to get up to the bluffs. And people just don't think about that. You don't think about guys with bulldozers as being worthy of awards from the president of the United States, but they really are, because they do such an amazing job.
For sure. I mean, it's you think of it this way: you're doing what is like a job that you have in normal life, building a road. but you're doing it under fire. So what has to take priority really for you as an engineer is to build the road. I mean, at least if you're an infantryman or a tanker, you're supposed to fight. You're supposed to fight back, to go assault and take the ground. And maybe that helps you minimize the fire you're under. As an engineer, you just kind of got to take it and depend on everybody else to help you. And I'm glad that marker is there, because I think it kind of stands in for many others in the course of that day and the campaign that's going to follow. The crucial role that engineers are going to play in this whole thing. I mean, I don't think I can overstate that.
Joe, you want to add to that?
Well, I want to also add, John touched on the 2 engineer battalions that were actually separate from the special engineer brigades that were formed into something called the Special Engineer Task Force. And as John said, they were an ad hoc unit that was organized as recently as April of '44, when they realized the extent of the German beach obstacles. And their entire job was to, as John touched on, to blow gaps through the obstacles on the beach, so that when high tide came, there would be marked paths by which landing craft approached the beach without endangering themselves on submerged mined obstacles. But I just want to say that indicative of this was the fact was absolutely fantastic Army and Navy cooperation, because part of those special engineer task forces were the forerunners of U.S. Navy SEALs, the underwater demolition teams. Every LCM that carried an obstacle clearing team to the beach had a 7-man U.S. Navy underwater demolition team attached to it. And the U.S. Navy SEALs just put up a major monument at the foot of the E1 draw last summer.
Yeah, that's the draw I was talking about.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. That one's near the famous pillbox that was knocked out by, well, various units. But anyway, the Navy SEALs take great pride in their Omaha Beach legacy. So it was not simply an Army operation, and they took 50% casualties as well. So.
Since you're talking about that pillbox, I'll bring in a question from Frank Cook, who's one of our longtime viewers, who says, can you speak about the role of the U.S. and British destroyers providing close-in fighting at Omaha? Because that pillbox at the E1 draw was hit by the 18th Infantry, the destroyer that hit it, that came so close that people said it was right up on the shore. But talk to us a little bit about the importance of destroyers in D-Day. And since we're talking about the 1st Division sector, John, I'll go to you first.
Well, and also, but to add on, jump onto what we're
Sure.
saying, if you can, fold in like what coordination was done between the Army and the Navy before that even starts, before they get there.
Yeah, so we do have the existence of the JASCO teams at this point, Joint Assault Signal Companies, that are designed to enhance and facilitate communications between the supporting warships and the troops that are coming ashore. Now, I don't think it's where it's going to be later in the war, like say about the Battle of Okinawa. That is much more sophisticated than what we're going to see at Normandy, ironically. And what I think is the sort of irony of ironies of the whole day, when the destroyers do come in to play such a crucial role around later morning, the communication is rudimentary in terms of they're just sighting on where they see the tanks or other ordnance firing on targets around Omaha Beach, and then kind of sighting in and shooting to help. They're not really in direct communication. And I think I have criticized something of the operational planning, because I think there's way too much priority given to getting artillery ashore when the Navy can be your artillery on this day if you're using it correctly. And the reason this matters is there's not enough shipping to have medical evacuation, in my view, just in my opinion. But so in terms of specific ships, there's USS Emmons, there's Frankfurt, there's Harding, there's Carmick, just to name a few that have been in play. There's USS Satterley over at Point Tahawk, of course. they are giving crucial fire. Eventually, there's going to be, as I'm sure you guys know, a raging argument as to who took down that pillbox at WN65 that's there today, of course. There's the anti-aircraft people who like to take credit for it because they had gone ashore with the initial waves. Like you said, the 18th Infantry, there's the destroyers. To me, I see it as all the above. And
right.
What's the point for us who weren't there, I guess? But we weren't there. Maybe it's a different perspective. But I think that is absolutely crucial what the destroyers do in terms of lending good on-site 5-inch gun fire support at the very time that you needed it with reasonable accuracy.
Joe?
I agree. Although when I was writing my books, there is a sub-story there, and the methodology was by no means perfect. And between a communication between the naval support parties on the beach and the guys on the destroyers, and of course the chaos on the beach accentuated that problem. And John will tell you, there were many unfortunate cases of friendly fire, including the most notable one, which occurred against the very prominent Colville steeple, which it's been years since I wrote my book, but correct me if I'm wrong, John. Joe Dawson of Company G was actually in the church, right, when it was hit by U.S. destroyer fire. Is that right?
He's nearby. He's close enough that he might as well be in there. He'd had his Joey had earlier in the day that, remember that incident where he goes inside the church with 2 or 3 of his guys and they fight it out with what is probably a German observation team. So tragic, of course. He leaves the church at that point. He gets hit by a ricochet, I think. So he's wounded in the leg. And so the background of what Joe mentioned is that one of the destroyers had orders. In fact, several of them did, but in particular, one of them had orders that, by 1800 hours, if you don't know Colville is for sure in American hands, you need to lay down a fire mission on that church. And the communications were such that G Company 16th Infantry, Dawson's company, could not get that word to them. And that led actually to G Company's biggest casualties.
Right, more casualties from that than from anything else.
Yeah, that's the tragedy of the whole thing. So it's really all about communications. And I would argue that their communications, for being such a well-planned, high-stakes operation, so sophisticated in some ways, I would argue their communications were not quite up to snuff to what you would expect, at least.
I'll add a comment here, and I'm sure I got this from one or both of your books, right? So I want to credit that. But one of the stories that I love to tell people about is the tanker Walter Skiba, who's out there on Omaha Beach in the 1st Division sector, and he's firing on targets. And the destroyer that's there, I think it's the Frankfurt, they see him firing on targets, and they're like, well, whatever he fires at, he must be seeing something we're not seeing, so we're going to fire at it. And so it's like he fires his little gun, and then boom comes the bigger gun from the destroyer, which works out really well. But eventually, of course, Skiba's tank is hit. He's killed, awarded a Silver Star. And a lot of people believe that's the tank that you see in the famous picture of the landing craft landing on Omaha Beach. And you see a kind of a tank there. And then a lot of people think that was Skiba's tank. Okay, that's my little story there.
So, as you guys know, I have a great deal of interest in, well, first of all, one of my big things is that D-Day is not an American victory or a British victory, it's an Allied effort. So without obviously taking anything away from the focus, could you talk a little bit about the involvement of, say, other nations? I know the British are obviously involved in some of the landing craft. I think there's an RAF unit that gets ashore there later in the day. And then also maybe what some Americans might be doing on the British or Canadian beaches, if you're aware of that. Silence.
I can talk about the 29th.
Thanks, Joe.
Vector, if you
Yeah, sure. The British landing craft, yeah.
Well, one can't talk about this without the how should I say, there was a fury that erupted in Britain, when the movie Saving Private Ryan was released, because the movie depicted the Rangers being brought to shore by U.S. Navy landing craft. And you don't really have to have read too much about D-Day to know that every single Ranger unit was brought to shore by Royal Navy assault flotillas with the LCAs as opposed to LCVPs. And LCAs, in many, many respects, were, if you were talking about pure protection against close-in fire when landing against a defended beach, the LCA was far superior because it was armored. So, you know, that uproar never really subsided. And it got worse when Steven Spielberg was quoted as saying there was no British involvement on Omaha Beach. And but of course, it was much deeper than that. There were many British warships that participated in the bombardment. There was an entire what did they call it? There was a type of gunboat, a landing craft that was converted to a close range, I think it was LCTG, and it was manned entirely by Royal Marine. And the only thing I'll say in summary is the British contribution to American beaches was much more significant than the American contribution to British beaches. And I'll leave it at that. And John can corroborate what happened on the 1st Division sector.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, exactly right. Now, you don't have quite as many British crewed landing craft on the Big Red One side, but you know, overall at Omaha Beach, absolutely. The RAF unit that Chris had alluded to is going to be working with Army aviation engineers for obvious reasons. To develop that, you need coordination. Of course, nearby at Port-en-Bazan, you're going to have the Royal Marines fighting there, who are going to be linking up with the Big Red One and other units, you know, pushing east to pull back the lens a little bit in terms of the multinational aspect of this. There's 12 countries that contribute to the Normandy invasion, of which Britain and the U.S. are the leaders, of course, but they're not the only ones. I mean, the Canadian role in D-Day as a whole, I think.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Okay.
So overlooked, in my opinion, and so incredibly important. I think the Canadians arguably are the most successful on D-Day in terms of achieving their objectives, what they're there to do. Canadian 3rd Division is a very high-speed unit that's designed to stave off a lot of armored counterattacks, and they basically do just that. In terms of the fighting on the beaches, next to Omaha Beach, they experienced some of the roughest fighting at Juno Beach and some parts of Juno Beach. Just like Omaha, there are some parts really heavier and worse than others, of course, depending on where you're landing and when. So, yeah, that's something I think is really important to understand, is what a team effort this really was. And the U.S. has the plurality of the forces going ashore, but not the majority. And it's a little different than the campaign we're going to follow, that we're going to fight eventually. Post D-Day, eventually it's going to be predominantly American in terms of about 2/3 of the manpower and financial power and material power, but we're not really there yet on D-Day. And so everybody's got a little skin in the game. There's Norwegians involved. There's a Greek ship or two. There's Australians involved. French, of course, French commandos, but of course French resistance and French civilians who are mixed up in this whole thing too. I think that's really important to understand in this day and age as Americans. And I've always felt that the Normandy invasion is really the seeds of what becomes NATO. You know, and everyone really has an important role. So yeah, I think especially it's Americans who need that lesson. And Saving Private Ryan, as amazing as it is, I can totally understand why the British would have been offended by it, like Joe said, in terms of the crewing of the landing craft, but also the swipe at Montgomery later in the movie. And of course, he's the kind of person who probably deserves swipes here and there, but it's also kind of a mindless discussion that Captain Miller and Ted Danson have, and they're kind of ripping on Monty as if he's the reason why we're stalemated in Normandy, and I think that's kind of absurd and wrong. So I totally get where our British friends are coming from.
Well, and I also think it's interesting that you know, one of the places I always go when I take my trips, I go to Juno Beach, and if you go down by Cozy's bunker there by the Canadian Museum, there's a company, the Royal Winnipegs, that suffers casualties just as bad as a company at 116th. And I don't think anybody outside of Winnipeg even knows about it, you know.
Right.
But anyway, that's
So-
my
Well,
rant.
and you've got when you're
100%.
going down to Utah Beach, you drive by the Danish Memorial.
Mhm.
In case you forgot that many Danish ships and soldiers were involved in the Normandy landings and took casualties as well. One of their ships was sunk, right? So yeah, so that's a whole story. So I want to remind everybody what we're doing here. This is History Happy Hour, and we're chatting with John McManus and Joe Balkoski, who are two very notable D-Day historians. I think you guys all know them. I think that's why we have such a large audience for this show. And John McManus is also a very noted podcaster. We do want to give him that, right?
Podcasts span the globe.
Right.
The globe.
Many podcasts.
Show us your mug, John. Show us your
Wow,
mug.
there's a lot of them. Someone talked.
Oh, hang
Yeah,
on. Let's
yeah.
get a close up of that. Okay, there we go. Someone
Yeah.
talked. That's one of John's
One of
podcasts.
his many. He can't keep track of them.
So alongside History Happy Hour, you have to listen to Someone Talked.
And
Oh,
Joe
it's like-
Balkoski is
There
putting
you go,
on the
Joe.
hat. I didn't even have to ask it, right? Because he is our only more than 5-time guest, and he's got the hat, which he's offering for sale at what was it, $2?
Joe's
I'll
retirement.
pay you $2. Take the No, I love the hat. I love it. I wear it all the time.
Cool.
We
It's
appreciate that you can still find it. So I can, Chris and I were just in Europe together, and we did manage one day, I think, where we wore our hats together to
Good.
introduce History Happy Hour one day. So that was a good thing. So there's a few different questions I could go to, but I'm going to go with one from Skip Esty. And he says that he likes to challenge his Marine Corps friends by asking them how many Marines, or people like to challenge him by asking how many Marines were present at D-Day. And his response is none. The Marines were engaged elsewhere. But then he says that he wants to know, were the Marines present in Normandy on June 6, 1944? If yes, in what capacity? And I got a thumbs up there from Joe Balkoski. So Joe, over to you.
Yeah, they were present there was a Marine contingent on every U.S. Navy battleship, the Texas, Arkansas, and Nevada. And again, John, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the Marine contingent on the Texas actually armed themselves and were ready to go into Pointe du Hoc at one point when the crisis was deepening, but did not. But there was a substantial number of Marines present in Overlord.
Exactly right. But they just didn't, of course, assault the beaches or whatever. I think some of them maybe landed later on to say they had done that, and it's very small numbers. But yeah, I think that Marine contingent, you're talking about, I think, what, Joe, like several dozen Marines aboard each of those battleships. That was a long tradition. And yeah, these guys were kitted up, and they thought they were going to be used at Pointe du Hoc. And so they had a bit of an adrenaline dump, I assume, later on. But yeah, so Marines were involved, but not the way they usually are, I guess.
Well, I think actually there's some Marines that appear in photographs on some of the U.S. Navy ships, like guarding prisoners after those first few waves are coming in. You see them in some of the photographs. Yeah.
Yeah.
So another question from the guest. It's a little unclear, so I'm going to kind of read it out and then we'll maybe clarify it. But question for everyone: what's the most impactful audible that was called on the ground after the operation started that had the biggest payoff, i.e., an improvisation? So I think what we're saying is,
well,
and I want to add that's from Bill G, and he did like 5 different versions of this question.
yeah. So I'm trying to get one of them answered.
So
but-
Chris has gotten one. Bill, we're sorry if we didn't get your final question, but the idea still, I think, stands. Is that he says one time he says the most impactful, one time he says the craziest audible called on the ground, which may be a different one, but you can answer either of those, guys.
I would say impactful. It's what Theodore Roosevelt Jr. does at Utah Beach, when, of course, they land in the wrong spot, about a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile, a little too far to the south. And it seems like a no-brainer nowadays as we think of it. Well, that's where they've landed. Why wouldn't they just send follow-on forces there and go from that direction? But remember that I mean, all the plans are predicated on landing elsewhere in that original spot, that original beach. And, so this has to do certainly with reinforcement, with logistics, with coordination with the Navy. All of this could be problematic, when you've landed in the wrong spot. So it's not quite as easy a decision as maybe it seems to us all these years later, knowing how things turned out. It's a little bit of a gamble because also Roosevelt is risking kind of choke pointing and bottlenecking a lot of all the Utah Beach landing forces along one, maybe two causeways at the most, and there are 4 overall that we have to have. So I think, I don't know, I wouldn't say it's crazy, but certainly it's an audible, and I think I would argue it has as much impact as any on D-Day. So what do you think, Joe? What do you think of some others, or what about that one?
I would say that's number one. Number two, in my view, somewhat related to the Roosevelt episode, was related to the 12th U.S. Infantry of the 4th Division, which was commanded by a very interesting fellow by the name of Russell Reeder. Red Reeder. He became well known in the U.S. Army because Marshall sent him early on in the Pacific War to study the fighting in, I think it was Guadalcanal. I'm pretty sure it was Guadalcanal. But right. he wrote a pamphlet on the, was it Guadalcanal?
It was, yeah.
Anyway, so he commanded the 12th Infantry, which was one of the first intact units to land on Utah Beach, in 2,500 to 3,000 men in one massive body. And as John mentioned, the problem with Utah Beach wasn't so much getting on the beach, it was getting off the beach. There were only 4 causeways, and they were, partially flooded, and they were jammed up very badly. And before the invasion, General Barton, the commander of the 4th ID, went to Reeder and he said, I want you to, get yourself off the beach as quickly as you can. And Reeder said, well, I can go between the causeways. And Barton said, well, they're going to be flooded. They're going to be pretty deep. Oh, and by the way, he said, Reeder, the French resistance has reported that the Germans, if you do that, are going to pour gasoline in the flooded fields and light it on fire. And I want you to figure out an answer to what you're going to do if that happens. And wouldn't you know, he crossed the, he literally went right through the flooded fields with water up to 6 feet deep. And he very famously wrote, a document later on. He said, I'm still searching for an answer for what to do if the Germans lit the fields. That was an audible. He took an entire regiment of 2,500 or more men through water almost a mile long, as deep as the height of a man. That was pretty daring, with the danger that the Germans were going to light them all on fire. So
much less artillery fire that they're taking as they do that. And it was a miserable experience for those guys, as you can imagine. Reeder later loses a leg in the Battle of Normandy because the 12th Infantry will kind of hook to the right and deal with those very fortified batteries that the Germans have heading up the Cotentin coast. He becomes very, very associated with like West Point athletics for the rest of his life. Really, really interesting guy. So his memoir, I highly recommend everyone. What's it called, Joe? Reveille to something? I don't know.
Reveille, right? Yeah.
Reveille, it's it. Yeah.
It is. It's a great book. And he, he was offered a professional baseball contract by John McGraw of the New York Giants. Right. He was supposed to be a very, very high level professional skilled baseball player. And he said, nah, I went to West Point, I'm going to give my life to my country, and ended up, giving his leg. And as you said, he went on to be, I think he was the baseball coach at West Point after the war, but quite a guy. Amazing guy. Yes.
Yeah. Well,
okay, that's on my list.
Since we've been talking about it, Omar Bradley, I think, does a great disservice to history by saying that Utah. Really, Rick? Thank you.
Sorry. Should have muted first, but couldn't.
That Utah Beach was a piece of cake. which it wasn't. But I mean, I know that this is a very broad topic, but maybe talk a little bit and compare and contrast the two beaches and some of the differences, and share your thoughts on the validity of Bradley's comment and why we have this perception of Utah Beach that we do.
I think it's easy for him to describe it as a piece of cake because he wasn't there, right? What do you think, Joe?
And I want to ask, John's impression. The fact of the matter is, and I hope John can support me on this, is that Omar Bradley's books were deficient in so many ways. He had, as far as I can tell, he had really nothing to do with writing them. They were both written by ghostwriters, and when I mean ghostwriters, I mean really. The first one was ghost written by Chet Hansen, and you can go to the U.S. Army War College at Carlisle and see the notes that Chet Hansen kept during the war, and it's very obvious that he did 99% of the writing. And when you read some of that, it's really Chet Hansen's impression of Bradley's command. And I'm really surprised that Bradley let some of those comments go through. And the second book was written when Bradley was in his upper 80s, and it was ghost written by Clay Blair. And I don't think Bradley was in a mentally strong position to contribute to that book. Am I right, John? I mean, have you found the same thing about it? I don't find anything valuable in Bradley's books.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. And I think Bradley actually died
before that book came out.
Yeah, before A General's Life could come out. So Clay Blair had to finish the project on his own, based on many, many hours of talking with Bradley, of course. But and Chet Hansen knew Bradley as well as anybody. But Chet Hansen did write the first one. I mean, A Soldier's Story, I think, something like that. But that's the one that came out in 1951. But to compare the two beachheads, I think in a general sense, at Omaha, you have tougher resistance up front. There's a kind of thicker crust that you have to break through on D-Day. And then in the aftermath, the next 4 or 5, 6 days, not quite as ferocious a resistance as what you have at Utah. So Utah is kind of the opposite. Now, the Americans suffer 197 casualties on D-Day at Utah. So it's not really safe, but most of that is artillery coming in. And that's going to be a problem going forward. And so as we advance off the beach and link up with the airborne and all that, then I think there's generally tougher resistance post D-Day in the Utah Beach area. Maybe not in the beach itself, but as they're starting to kind of take that right turn to Cherbourg and try and push west across the peninsula, where you have some of the most ferocious fighting of the whole Normandy campaign at Lafayette, which goes on for the better part of 3 to 4 days and leads to some of the most dramatic fighting near that tiny little bridge that really is all about the causeway, the flooded causeway. So I think that's the general pattern. But Bradley describing Utah as a piece of cake is a classic kind of senior officer's point of view, map board point of view, and an aide point of view who's not there in Hansen. They're not the ones who were part of Utah, so to them, yeah, it seems a piece of cake compared to what they dealt with at Omaha that day.
Well, what about when people say, well, everything goes right at Utah Beach, everything goes wrong at Omaha Beach?
That's terrible. John made extremely cogent comments there, but I will make one addition. Utah Beach was the only one of the 5 invasion beaches in which the assault craft had to sail directly through a minefield. And there were very, very bad losses. A tank LCT craft was blown up with the turret flying like 50 feet in the air, and an artillery battery was essentially blown up by a mine. The mines were ingenious. They were supposedly the unsweepable German. I'm not sure whether they were pressure mines or magnetic mines, but they were really not very sweepable. And part of the story of the Utah invasion is that the admiral in command of the invasion fleet, Ray Moon, boy, somebody should write a book about him. He, according to Joe Collins, who was the 7th Corps commander on on Utah Beach. And remember that in an amphibious assault, the Navy really is in charge until the Army gets ashore. Joe Collins, in his memoir, remarked that Ray Moon, the admiral, was thinking of calling off the later waves on Utah Beach because the mines were wreaking such havoc. And Collins had to convince him not to do it. And that could have changed everything had Moon gotten his way. And of course, Ray Moon was a very deeply troubled person. You know that he went to the Mediterranean to participate in Operation Dragoon, and he was on his command ship in Naples Harbor. And I forget when it was. I think it was only 2 months later, in August of '44. And he sat at his desk and he said, he wrote a note saying, "I'm sick. I am so sick." And he put a bullet to his head and shot himself through the head. And people speculated that he felt guilty about Exercise Tiger. He was raked over the coals very unfairly about Exercise Tiger. And he was, also very troubled about what had happened with the minefield on Utah Beach. So that, Omaha did not really have to worry about mines. And that made a big difference.
Well, the other thing I would add to this, somebody mentioned the casualties on Utah Beach, and those are the 4th Division casualties. But let's add into that the casualties from the 82nd and 101st Airborne, who are landing to seize the draws at Utah Beach, and without whom it would have been very hard for the 4th Division to get inland. And I don't know the exact casualty numbers that they suffer, but you add to that and suddenly it becomes much closer to the Omaha Beach numbers. So I think, and you were talking about the audible that Theodore Roosevelt called to land, in the first and second draws there, and to follow up with that. But how badly might that have gone if Dick Winters and the Company E of the 506th Parachute Infantry hadn't taken out the guns at Breakcore Manor? So, all of these things kind of fold into each other and make it a much more complicated picture than Omar Bradley might have seen. I want to actually, just a question that just occurred to me. So Chet Hansen's memoirs or his diary is at the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So why hasn't that ever been published as a book on its own? Did he specify that it wasn't supposed to be? I mean, why isn't that available someplace aside from if I drive to Pennsylvania and read it there?
It's a good question.
I actually wrote a note to the. Excuse me, John. I actually wrote a note to the chief archivist there, whose name was Dave Keogh, and I said, "Why isn't Chet Hansen's stuff, published?" He wrote an email back to me. He said, "I don't know. Why don't you ask him?" He said, because he lived until his upper 90s, and I didn't dare ask Chet Hansen to whether I should have, but I didn't. I'm sorry, John, to interrupt.
Oh no! I was just speculate along with everyone else. I mean, I assume it's copyrighted material, and that there are others who would probably not want that published, maybe, or are only under their auspices. I'm not sure, but like some other material that's there, General Gavin's diary, the ADC, the 82nd Airborne Division, that was published in a format by Louis Sorley, I think 2 years ago. I think it would be neat to see Hansen's diary published.
I'd love to see it. I'm tempted to just spend a week and drive to Carlisle and put up in the hotel and just read it there. But, it also, it's more than 75 years after the end of World War II. So and he also wrote it as a U.S. Army officer. So it would be under the, it would probably be a public document. So I don't really understand why it hasn't been published.
Yeah, maybe everyone's just gotten around to it.
Get on it, guys.
It's as simple as that.
Everybody, let's race. Let's see who can bring it out first.
Yeah.
Let's all race to Carlisle.
Chris?
So, well, yeah. So we're kind of getting to the point now where we're going to get asked these big, deep philosophical questions. But
we still have more than 100 viewers live.
Yeah,
so we shouldn't give up yet. We appreciate you guys staying. Don't go away.
Well,
Stay with us for the next 15
people
minutes.
should ask us questions so that Rick and I don't drone on.
They have been. There are other ones.
But, D-Day has to be one of the most talked about, written about, podcasted about topics of the Second World War. Are there areas that you think haven't had a real adequate look? I mean, you guys have spent more time studying this than most people. Are there topics, subjects, areas that you're like, somebody really ought to look into that?
Yeah, so that was also my last question, although it doesn't have to be last. But I would add to that, is there anything new to be discovered, and where would you look for it?
And how would you write it? And who? Geez, come on.
Yeah. Let me just get my pen here. And what would you? Well, how would you start that book? Yeah.
Sure. Let me give you the outline.
Opening line would be, yeah.
Here's a proposal.
It's like a chapter list, if you could, please.
Right. Well, I mean, it's endlessly compelling because obviously it's a pretty darn important thing. We're still talking about it 82 years later. We talk about it every year at this time, don't we?
Yeah.
We always are looking for new insights, and I think we kind of see it differently in relation to whatever's going on with current events. Now, I tend to think that our mutual friend Craig Simons is really onto something when he says that I think he feels maybe the naval side has been overlooked, the whole shipping dimension to this, and that could, just the way I think of it, that could take us into maybe a study of the ordinary sailor's experience, which I think could be quite interesting, because it's an amphibious invasion, so we tend to put the soldiers first, because obviously they have the lead role, but I don't know that there's any book I can think of that really focuses exclusively on the soldier's experience.
Sailors,
in the what?
The sailors, you meant to say.
Yeah, sorry, on the sailor's experience, and also alternatively, another sphere, the airman's experience too. Sometimes it gets a little vague. We hear a lot about the abortive bombing raid on Omaha Beach, which is not effective, of course, but there's a lot more aerial dimension to D-Day than just that, and especially fighter pilots too, some of which is kind of boring duty of anti-submarine patrols out there, at the margins of the invasion force, some of which is quite interesting too in terms of strafing operations that really hinder the German movement on D-Day. But of course, to close the loop too, I mean, the German perspective, I think, would always be the best, but we've been burned on that, haven't we? That book that came out whenever it was a few years ago that was primarily contrived. But it's hard to get the German perspective for a lot of reasons, one of which is many of them didn't survive.
Yeah.
Joe, you want to add to that?
I have to say I tried. When my Omaha Beach book was, I wrote to Yogi Berra, who was I believe he was a petty officer, third class on one of the LCTR craft that had been converted to a rocket firing vessel. I think he was only 19 years old. Most people didn't know that he was, he was off of Omaha Beach, and he's a St. Louis native, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, no response. So I gave it my best shot. But in my opinion, that would have been nice. In my opinion, one of the areas that I think needs a real detailed look are the troop carrier contribution to the airborne drops, both British and American, because those guys, their stories have really not been told. I mean, they came over just months before the invasion by the hundreds from the States, and they only learned their mission in the last couple of, the last 2-3 months. And, it's very hard to practice airborne drops. You can't do them very often. And, let's face facts. An airborne operation of that size had never been attempted in World War II, and in particular at night. And not only at night, but over heavily defended enemy territory. And bottom line, when you really analyze how they did, despite some of the naysayers out there, it was remarkable given the limitations they had in training and the short warning that they had for the operation. And I knew many of those troop carrier pilots, and they really felt unappreciated. And I think there's a story to be told there too. Yeah,
for sure. And I would say unfairly impugned, especially by the paratrooper viewpoint of being scattered all over and kind of blaming the troop carrier pilots. The point I've made many, many times, I hope not to the point of ad nauseum, but I think it bears repeating, is the paratroopers are going to be just as dead if you fly straight into the anti-aircraft fire that you're facing there and your plane gets shot down. So it really is a better go to kind of improvise to get away from that fire the best you can and get them on the ground somewhere. Not over the sea, of course. That's the worst circumstances. That happens to some, unfortunately. But by and large, the failure, if there is any, is in the failure to suppress the anti-aircraft assets that the Germans have on the Cotentin Peninsula, which the Army Air Forces, in their usual kind of optimistic aplomb, had said, don't worry, that's going to be taken care of. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't taken care of. So who really took the brunt of that? The troop carrier crew, who now had to fly into heavy anti-aircraft fire in many cases without self-sealing fuel tanks, with really no armor to speak of any kind, planes chock full of paratroopers and sometimes weaponry and ordnance that could lead you to become a Roman candle in the sky like that. So, to me, asking them to go straight into the anti-aircraft fire to get to the proper zone somehow in the middle of this chaos is equivalent to being, if we're on the ground, being asked to charge a machine gun nest head on. It doesn't make any sense. So I'll echo what Joe has said, that I don't think their story has been told as thoroughly as maybe it could be, but perhaps maybe as sympathetically as it could be, because I will be the first to defend them on that, in that respect.
So we'll go for one more.
Napoleon famously said that luck was one of the most important elements of war, and the troop carrier pilots were really one of the most unlucky groups of people on D-Day, because within 5 minutes of their drop-downs, they flew straight into an extremely thick cloud bank. And you remember, those planes were flying wingtip to wingtip, and you couldn't even see an adjacent airplane in that cloud bank. That is what you call bad luck. And for them to have persevered through that bad luck is extremely notable to me. Anyway, my last point on that.
Agree.
No, and I'll just, here's a good, possibly closing question, although I don't forestall the right of my co-host to follow it with something. But from one of our viewers, Ron Dries, who says, what lessons did the Allies learn and incorporate in fighting during the rest of the war?
Big question, right, Joe? What didn't they learn?
That's a tough one.
Well, certainly it informs Anvil Dragoon. I think, you talked about mines. They're going to be dealing with mines at Anvil Dragoon more so than ground opposition. So that's the invasion of South France on August 15th, 1944. They amend the airborne side a little bit. They're going to land, I think, about a division's worth of airborne forces, and they're going to do it more or less at dawn, because they're a little leery of the night drop that they had in Normandy, which, of course, are quite inaccurate. They have a better understanding of the kind of shipping that they're going to need, the kind of fire support that makes the most sense. The communications I alluded to, I would say, like the JASCO teams and the other ways to communicate ship to shore, I think that really, really manifests a little bit better in the Pacific, more so than in Dragoon. Whereas, where in Dragoon, you don't necessarily have too much of the heavy opposition on D-Day among ground forces against you. You've got some, but not quite what you're facing in Normandy quite typically. So, that's just a few examples. At the squad level, what kind of weapons you're going to use, how you incorporate logistics, what you do with squad level communications. Training, how you train people up on various weapons and for higher positions in a command hierarchy. All of that is going to be part of this as well. Loading too, as well.
Well, Joe?
Should I go? One of the things that I think comes out of Normandy, but not so much the the Neptune phase of the invasion, but what starts to happen in the follow-up days, is that it became very clear that tactical air power was not nearly as proficient as it should be, given the Allied air dominance. And ground troops in the first 6, 7, 8, maybe even 9 weeks of the Normandy campaign are frustrated by the fact that with all of this tactical air power at their disposal, they really can't use it to advantage on the battlefield. But it was a revolution that was building up gradually, because by the time of the breakout and the liberation of France and the rush into Brittany, tactical air power was certainly changing the nature of the battlefield, because both the British and the Commonwealth and American armies became much, much more proficient at immediate communication between a ground stalemate and fighter bomber pilots in the air. And I think that became a very important, almost revolutionary development in the weeks after D-Day.
So, Chris, unless you have something more to ask.
Well, I would just say, are we still going to be talking about this for the 100th anniversary of D-Day? No, I'm not being flipped. I mean, is it that important? And if so, why?
Yeah,
I think it will be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, what about the wild part?
In my opinion, I saw how the historiography of the Civil War evolved, and I'm sure John will agree with me. When I was a kid, the level of knowledge of Civil War operations and battles was, although very good, with some wonderful authors, it was nothing compared to what you're getting today. I mean, we're in the last 50 years, you can learn about any regiment in the Union or Confederate armies and what it did in meticulous detail at every battle. And we're still getting accounts that are notable in how they reveal new information about Civil War operations. And I have no doubt that that's going to be happening about the Normandy campaign in the next 50 years.
I think so too. I think that there will be that micro level, but there will also be new ways to understand it too. Probably historians coming along asking questions that maybe we never thought of, or questions that will become more relevant in relation to wherever history goes from here. All these different little twists and turns that maybe we can't anticipate now. And of course, it's kind of sobering to think of, but the 100th anniversary is only 18 years away.
I know. I said 200. Yeah.
I hope we will. But even if we don't, I think there will be other historians, and already are, who can speak to this and bring new dimensions to it. If something is large and important enough, as clearly this is, there's always kind of new dimensions to explore, like the Civil War that Joe was talking about. I think this will go on for a long, long time, in my opinion.
So June 5th, 2044 is a Sunday.
We'll book you now.
So can we all agree that I'll be 88 years old? Some of you will be older, some of you not as old. And can we all agree that we can come back on June 5th, 2044, wherever you are, and participate in a history happy hour about
there
this?
There we go.
Book it right now. I'm there.
Joe will have like 15 hats by then.
Joe will have an entire suit of clothes, history hour clothes. So thank you so much to our guest today. Go ahead, Joe.
I will have my nursing home's address for you by that time. So,
fantastic. We can maybe at that point we'll bring on the AI version of Joe Balkoski.
We will. Well, AI version of all.
We want to thank our guests today, Joe Balkoski, who's the author of Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, Beyond the Beachhead. John McManus is the author of, and John, I always have a hard time remembering the title of this book, but it's The Dead and Those About to Die, as well as many books about the Pacific, which we've been interviewing him about. We'll have him on again in a few weeks to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys.
For joining us today.
Thank you. Been a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Okay. And Chris, okay, next week. We have an encore episode. I know I can hear the big in the crowd, but we have an encore episode with David Nassau, author of The Wounded Generation, about the pain and hardships that veterans endured upon their return home. And then, and after that, we have, I think, 8 live shows in a row.
Get out.
So you just have to do one more encore episode, and then you're just going to be like live. You're going to get your fill. And the last thing I'm going to mention, even though I'm out of alcohol, is that on Friday nights at 9 p.m. on a show called The Unexplained on the History Channel, which I'm sure you watch faithfully every week.
Oh, you had to slip that in. You didn't even tell me that. No, wait. You didn't. There was no pre-show discussion about this. But
no. Right. On The Unexplained with William Shatner, there's going to be a segment on, can you guess? The Ghost Army. And perhaps if you watch, you'll even see me as part of it. I don't know.
Did you ask William Shatner to say History Happy Hour?
I'm hoping
that's what we watched on the Enterprise.
I was going to go online and like make a bet whether William Shatner would say my name during that. You know,
Scotty, beam him up and get him to shut up about the Ghost Army. That's
okay, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Chris, shut up. You shut up. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Stay safe.